We're going to talk about brainwashing and gravity. Both terms are difficult to define scientifically. So let's look at gravity from the National Center for Science Education. It says the universal theory of gravity is often taught in schools as a fact, when in fact it is not even a good theory. First of all, no one has measured gravity for every atom and every star. It is simply a religious belief that it is universal. Secondly, school books routinely make false statements. For example, the moon goes around the earth. If the theory of gravity were true, it would show that the sun's gravitational force on the moon is much stronger than the earth's gravitational force on the moon, so the moon would go around the sun. Anybody can look up at night and see the obvious gaps in gravity theory. Anyway, just to go on with that a little bit more, so Sir Isaac Newton gave us this formula to determine what gravitational force is and how to measure it. And the formula was good enough to get us to the moon and back. You know, we didn't need Einstein yet for that, but Einstein did expand on Newton. He didn't erase him, but he expanded our understanding with his general theory of relativity. But he came up with something called the equivalence principle, and I'm just going to read this from the site sciencefocus.com. The equivalence principle is based on what Einstein described as his happiest thought. This was that if a person falls freely, he will not feel his own weight. In other words, acceleration and gravity are exactly equivalent and indistinguishable. We see this happening on the International Space Station. The pull of gravity at the station's orbital distance from Earth is around 90% of that on the surface, and yet astronauts float. Now, this is important. The reason people float about up there is because they are constantly falling towards our planet. We might expect them to crash into the Earth's surface, but they are also moving sideways at just the right speed to keep missing. That's what being in orbit involves. All right, so I've used this concept of orbiting to describe what happens when people are strongly attached to a particular point of view, and it occupies their main focus of interest day in and day out for a long period of time. So in other words, you know, if you become a great fan of some football team, and you're during the football season, your thoughts and ideas will orbit around that particular team and its wins and losses. But we can extend that to religions, new religions, and cults, where people become so involved that that is their central focus, and their life orbits around these ideas. So the interesting thing here about orbiting, looking at brainwashing and gravity, is that the authority figure doesn't want people coming too close to his authority, in other words, taking over the authority. So the authority figure, or the mass in the middle, has to keep people moving at such a speed, in other words, on a mission, just enough to keep them in orbit without getting too close to power, or getting them to think too much outside the power structure and spin out, in other words, move out of orbit of their particular internal universe and what they're trying to sell. So this idea of orbiting and control of the path of a cult member or a devotee in a particular religious organization is necessary. There has to be just enough mission involved, or just enough speed involved, to keep them circling around this. So there's been a lot of controversy over the term brainwashing, and in many cases, for instance, certain what some people call cult apologists, but these are sociologists that criticize the anti-cult movement. And they have some good criticisms, obviously. One of the earliest books that came out was called The New Vigilantes, by Bromley and Shoup, Deprogrammers, Anti-Cultists, and the New Religions. And in here they cite Dick Anthony's research on so-called brainwashing and cult influence. And Anthony was very important in the courts because he got courts to dismiss the idea that there's any scientific validity behind any notions of brainwashing. From his Wikipedia entry on Dick Anthony, he has characterized brainwashing as a pseudo-scientific myth and spearheaded efforts which from 1990 onward led to the general rejection of brainwashing testimony as unscientific in the United States in courts. Anthony asserted in the Washington Post that no reasonable person would question that there are situations where people can be influenced against their best interests, but those arguments are evaluated on the basis of fact, not bogus expert testimony. So, right, anyone that's considered an expert about brainwashing or cult influence or undue influence or the harm that certain groups can cause people are called bogus expert testimony here. Dismissing the idea of mind control, he has defended new religious movements and argued that involvement in such movements may often have beneficial rather than harmful effects. Of course, that depends who you're talking to. A lot of group members claim that their experience in cults that other people consider harmful has been good for them. You can't argue that. It's anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence seems to drive how most people see most things. Science is very hard to do, and it can be very difficult to establish scientific principles about brainwashing and cult formation and all of that stuff, just as there is about gravity. However, we all can agree that gravity as a term is very useful, and there are theories which may not stand up to criticism in all ways that help us understand what gravity is. We would not have been able to get to the moon and back without it. I think brainwashing falls under a similar milieu of scholarship, in that it's an established fact that something like brainwashing takes place, but it can be called gaslighting, can be called undue influence, it can be called recruitment, it can be called manipulative authoritarian behavior. You can label all kinds of things out there, and these things are very real, just as apples fall from trees. Gravity, no matter how we define it, is a very real thing. There's real effects from it. But we can't dismiss the idea of gravity because we have no precise science about it. And just like we shouldn't dismiss the idea of brainwashing by any other name like thought control or mind control or undue influence, just because we have no precise factual scientific definition of what it is. And we've been battling that out in the courts for quite some time. This book, Misunderstanding Cults, edited by Benjamin Zablocki and Thomas Robbins, searching for objectivity in a controversial field, covers a lot of this territory, and I recommend you read Misunderstanding Cults if you want to get a better idea of how and why brainwashing is a useful concept to some scholars like Benjamin Zablocki. In Zablocki's chapter, he asks, do we need to know whether cults engage in brainwashing? The question of why people believe the sometimes bizarrely insane commands of charismatic leaders, even unto death, is one of the big unsolved mysteries of history and the social sciences. If there are deliberate techniques that charismatic leaders and charismatically led organizations use to induce high levels of uncritical loyalty and obedience in their followers, we should try to understand what these techniques are and under what circumstances and how well they work. So he says this chapter is about nothing other than the process of inducing ideological obedience in charismatic groups. So he's not just arguing about brainwashing is real or not. He's actually going through studies that he did for 20 years on a particular group called the Brethren, or the Exclusive Brethren. So if you want to look at at arguments against the idea of brainwashing, you can look at the new Vigilantes. However, their focus is on the techniques used by Ted Patrick, who was the father of deprogramming, who coined the word deprogramming and advertised his services in the 70s mainly as a way to solve or cure the problem of harmful cults in society. His book, Let Our Children Go, written by Zablocki and him, is a way to understand Patrick's point of view. It's been highly criticized. I met Ted Patrick a couple times, and I got his card here, which is called the Mind Research and Development, and there's this logo, Black Lightning. Now, he was called Black Lightning by certain cults because he would, with his van, pick people up, striking like lightning, and take them away for a deprogramming session. Thankfully, those years are gone. Deprogramming rarely, if ever, takes place anymore. It was illegal, and it should have been illegal. But the way he defined brainwashing is not the way Professor Zablocki defines brainwashing, and I'd recommend the latter and his chapter in this book, Misunderstanding Cults, if you want to understand what that is. So, yeah, we can go out with Bob Dylan here, and even though we don't know what it is, Mr. Jones, there's something really going on here.